During a road trip last year, I was passing through West Virginia. It was getting close to midnight and I'd been driving for almost 6 hours straight, so I took the next exit, looking for a place to sleep. The exit led to this small town that barely qualified as a town. Just a few buildings clustered around one intersection. I drove around looking for any kind of motel, and finally spotted one about a mile past the main intersection. It looked like it had been built in the 70s and never updated. The sign out front was half burnt out, but I was exhausted, and it was the only option I'd seen, so I pulled in. The parking lot was almost completely full, which surprised me, given how empty the town seemed. I had to park near the back of the lot. The office was on the ground floor and still had its lights on. I walked in, and a younger guy, maybe mid-20s, was behind the counter on his phone. He looked up and asked if I needed a room. I said yes, and he said they only had one left. I paid with my card and he handed me an actual metal key. I asked if they had ice machines, and he pointed vaguely toward the second floor and said, "Yeah, up there somewhere." I grabbed my overnight bag from the car and headed upstairs. The second floor had an outdoor walkway that ran the length of the building. The room was basic but clean enough. One bed, a TV, a small table, bathroom. Nothing seemed wrong with it. I was starving because I hadn't eaten since lunch, so I decided to run back out and find food before everything closed. I'd passed a diner about 2 miles back that looked like it might still be open. I left my bag in the room and headed back down to my car. The diner was still open and I got a sandwich to go. The whole trip took maybe 25 minutes. When I pulled back into the motel parking lot, I immediately noticed something strange. The parking lot was completely empty. Every single car that had been there when I checked in was gone, including the cars that had been parked on both sides of mine. I sat in my car looking at the empty lot and trying to make sense of it. It was past midnight now, but it seemed impossible that every single guest had checked out or left in the 25 minutes I'd been gone. I got out and walked toward the stairs to the second floor. As I was climbing the stairs, I looked at the rooms on the first floor. All of their lights were off. I got to the second floor and walked down the walkway toward my room. Every single room was dark except mine, which I'd left the lamp on in. I got to my door and stopped. Something felt very wrong. I unlocked the door and went inside. Everything looked exactly how I'd left it, but the feeling that something was off wouldn't go away. I walked over to the window and looked out at the parking lot. My car was the only one there. The office lights were still on down below, so I decided to go ask the guy at the desk what was going on. I went back downstairs and into the office. The guy from before was still there, still on his phone. I asked him if there was some kind of event going on that made everyone leave at the same time. He looked confused and asked what I meant. I explained that the parking lot had been full when I checked in, but now it was completely empty. He got this weird expression on his face and said the motel had been empty all night, except for me. He said I was the only guest. I told him that was impossible, that I'd seen at least 20 cars when I arrived. He just shook his head and said no, it had been empty. He seemed annoyed that I was arguing with him about it. I didn't know what to say to that. I'd definitely seen cars in the lot. I wasn't mistaken about that. I asked if maybe they'd all been employee cars and everyone had gone home for the night. He said he was the only employee working and his car was parked in the back. I went back to my room feeling really unsettled. I locked the door and sat on the bed trying to figure out what I'd seen. I thought maybe I was just exhausted and had been confused about how many cars were actually there. But I knew what I'd seen. I tried to eat my sandwich, but I'd lost my appetite. I turned on the TV for background noise and just sat there. Around 1 a.m., I heard a door close somewhere on the second floor. I muted the TV and listened. Footsteps walked past my room on the walkway outside. I went to the window and looked out. Nobody was there. I opened my door and looked down the walkway in both directions. It was empty, but I definitely heard someone walk past. I closed and locked the door. I decided to just go to sleep and leave first thing in the morning. I turned off the lamp and got into bed. I'd been lying there for maybe 10 minutes when I heard another door close. All around the second floor, doors were closing one after another, like every room was occupied, and people were coming back to their rooms at the same time. Then I heard voices, muffled conversations coming from the rooms on either side of me and across the walkway. People were talking and moving around. I got up and looked out the window again. The parking lot was still empty, no cars except mine, but I could clearly hear people in the other rooms. I went to my door and looked through the peephole. The walkway outside was empty. I opened the door and looked out. Still nobody there, but the sounds continued. Doors opening and closing. Footsteps. Voices. I walked a few steps down the walkway and stopped in front of room 238, the one right next to mine. I could hear a TV playing inside and someone moving around. I knocked on the door. The sounds inside stopped immediately. I waited, but nobody answered. I knocked again and said hello. I tried the door handle, but it was locked. I went back to my room and locked the door behind me. The sounds continued all around me for another 10 minutes or so, then gradually stopped until everything was quiet again. I sat on the bed with the lights on and didn't sleep at all. At around 5 a.m., when the sky started getting light, I grabbed my bag and left. The guy from the front desk was gone, and the office was locked. I got in my car and drove away as fast as I could. About an hour later, when I was safely on the highway, I looked up the motel online. I found an article from 3 years ago about a fire at that lodge that had killed 18 people. The article said the motel had been permanently closed after the fire and was scheduled for demolition. I don't know what I experienced that night or what that place actually was, but I know I heard those people in the rooms around me, and I know the parking lot was full when I first arrived. This happened a few years ago when I was 26, and I had just spent a grueling 4-day weekend doing long exposure astrophotography deep in the woods of the Pacific Northwest. By the time I packed up my camera gear, I was operating on maybe 6 hours of sleep total for the entire trip. My plan was to drive the 4 hours straight back to the city, but the mountains have a way of changing your plans. About an hour into the drive, a massive pea soup fog bank rolled off the coast and completely swallowed the 2-lane highway. Visibility dropped to maybe 10 feet past my hood. Driving a winding mountain pass in total darkness with that kind of fog is basically a death wish. So I decided to pull over at the first place I saw. It was an old, U-shaped building surrounding a cracked asphalt parking lot. It sat completely by itself in a carved-out section of the deep woods, miles from the nearest actual town. I pulled up to the front office. The lot was completely empty, except for a rusty maintenance van. I walked into the lobby, which smelled heavily of ozone and cheap pine cleaner. The woman working the front desk was older, maybe in her 60s, and she looked incredibly on edge. She was aggressively chewing her fingernails and kept glancing at the static on the small security monitor behind her. I asked for a room for the night. She didn't make any small talk. She just took my credit card, ran it through an old clunky swiper, and handed me a physical brass key. "Room 22, she said, her voice tight. "It's the very last room on the left wing. Park your car directly in front of your door and keep your blinds drawn. The floodlights out back are broken." I thanked her, too exhausted to care about her weird intensity, and drove my car around the U-shape to the very end of the building. Room 22 was right at the edge of the property, where the asphalt stopped, and the dense tree line immediately began. The room was aggressively outdated. Orange shag carpet, wood-paneled walls, and a heavy floral bedspread, but it was warm and dry. I locked the deadbolt, fastened the chain lock, and collapsed onto the bed fully clothed. I didn't even turn on the TV. I just wanted to sleep. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up, but the room was pitch black. The shrill, mechanical ringing of the motel room phone had jolted me awake. It was that old, piercing trill of a landline. I fumbled in the dark, knocking my watch off the nightstand, and finally picked up the receiver.
Hello?
I mumbled, still half asleep.
Listen to me very carefully.
A woman whispered. It was the clerk from the front desk. Her voice was shaking so hard I could barely understand her.
Do not open your door, no matter what they say. Do not open it. I have already called the police, but they are 30 minutes out.
Before I could even process what she was saying, the line went dead. The dial tone buzzed loudly in my ear. My heart slammed against my ribs. I sat up slowly, staring into the dark room. The silence was suffocating. I hung the phone up and swung my legs out of bed. I was just about to reach for the bedside lamp when the knocking started. It wasn't a frantic pounding. It was 3 sharp, polite, incredibly patient knocks.
Hello in there.
A man's voice called out through the heavy wooden door. It was a smooth, casual voice.
This is the front desk. We had a glitch with the system and your card declined. I just need to swipe it again with the handheld reader so we don't have to kick you out.
I froze. The woman from the front desk had just called me from the office line. The person standing outside my door was absolutely not the front desk. I didn't make a sound. I didn't even breathe. I crept across the orange carpet on my bare feet, moving as silently as I could, until I was standing inches from the door. I leaned in and pressed my eye against the cold brass of the peephole. The fog outside was thick, but the yellow light from the walkway illuminated him perfectly. It was a man wearing a clean, dark suit. He didn't look like a mechanic or a drifter. He looked like a businessman. He was holding a small clipboard in one hand, but his face is what made my blood run cold. He was smiling, a wide, empty smile, and he was staring directly into the peephole. It was like he could see my eye on the other side of the glass.
I know you're standing there,
he said smoothly, his voice muffled by the wood.
I can see the shadow covering the glass. Just open up. It'll only take a second.
I backed away from the door, clapping my hand over my mouth to quiet my breathing. I looked around the room for a weapon. The heaviest thing I had was my metal camera tripod. I grabbed it, extending one of the legs to use like a bat.
Suit yourself,
the man outside sighed. Then, I heard the distinct jingle of a large key ring. My eyes darted to the deadbolt. I watched in absolute horror as the brass thumb turn of the deadbolt slowly began to rotate. He had a master key. I threw myself forward and grabbed the thumb turn with both hands, twisting it back into the locked position right as he tried to disengage it. I held it there with all my body weight. I could feel him on the other side, turning the key, fighting my grip. The metal was digging into my palms. We were locked in this silent, terrifying tug of war separated only by 2 inches of wood.
That's rude,
he whispered through the door. He wrenched the key hard, but I held the deadbolt steady. After a few agonizing seconds, the pressure released. I heard him pull the key out of the lock. I kept my eye glued to the peephole. I watched him casually adjust his tie, turn away from my door, and walk down the walkway. He stopped in front of room 21. He didn't knock. He just slid his key into the lock, turned it, and walked inside, pulling the door shut behind him. I didn't wait to hear what happened next. I didn't care if the police were coming. I quietly unlatched the heavy sliding glass window at the back of my room, popped the screen out, and dropped down into the wet brush at the edge of the tree line. I used the dense woods for cover, circling completely around the back of the property in the freezing fog until I reached my car. I army crawled into the driver's seat, kept my headlights off, and then threw the car into reverse. I peeled out of that lot and drove blindly through the fog at 50 miles an hour until I hit the main interstate. I read the local news for weeks after that, searching for any reports of a break-in or worse at that motel. I never found a single article. I was moving out of my dorm after my sophomore year of college. My school was a few states away, so I had a really long drive ahead of me, and I wanted to knock it out in 2 days. I was trying to be cheap, so instead of booking a nice place in advance, I just drove until I was too tired to keep my eyes open and pulled off the highway at some random exit. I found this really rundown 2-story motel. It was super cheap for the night, which was perfect for my broke college student budget. I got a room on the 2nd floor, all the way at the end of the outdoor balcony. I hauled my duffel bag up the metal stairs and went inside. It was a super basic room, just a bed, TV, a mini fridge, and this ugly, heavy armchair sitting in the corner by the window. I was pretty hungry, but I didn't want to drive anywhere else. So I left my bag on the bed and walked back down the balcony to where the vending machines were near the stairs. I was gone for maybe 3 minutes tops. When I walked back to my room, my door was open just a crack. I was positive I had pulled it shut until it clicked because it was a heavy door, but I figured maybe the latch was just old and sticky. I pushed it open and looked around. My bag was still there on the bed. My laptop was still inside. Nothing looked out of place at all, so I didn't really think much of it. I just made sure to push the door hard this time, heard the click, and flipped the metal chain latch over the frame. I watched some TV, ate some snacks, and ended up falling asleep pretty early, since I was exhausted from packing and driving all day. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up freezing. The AC wall unit was absolutely blasting icy air. I usually sleep through anything, but it was so cold, I had to get up to turn the dial down. I sat up in bed and rubbed my eyes. The room was pretty dark, except for the yellow light coming in through the curtains from the parking lot. When my eyes adjusted, my heart pretty much dropped into my stomach. That heavy, ugly armchair that was over by the window, it was now sitting right next to my bed, facing my pillows. I literally froze. There was maybe a foot of space between the edge of the mattress and the chair. I looked at the front door. It was closed, and I could see the metal chain was still flipped over the frame. My mind was racing, trying to figure out if I had moved the chair myself and just forgot. But there was no logical reason I would have dragged a heavy piece of furniture across the room just to go to sleep. Someone had been sitting right next to me while I slept. I didn't even want to move. But I slowly looked toward the bathroom. The door was pushed shut. I was absolutely not going to go open it to see if anyone was in there. I slowly slid off the opposite side of the bed, grabbed my keys and my phone, and didn't even bother putting my shoes on. I unlatched the front door as fast as I could and just bolted out into the parking lot to my car. I locked the car doors and called the front desk. I told the guy what happened and he sounded annoyed, but he came upstairs with a flashlight. I watched from my car as he went in. A few minutes later, he came out to the balcony and waved me up. I reluctantly went back up the stairs. He was standing in the bathroom pointing at the ceiling. The drop ceiling panels above the shower had been pushed aside, leaving this huge black square open to the crawl space that ran the whole length of the 2nd floor. He told me that sometimes, drifters find a way into the attic space and drop down into vacant rooms to sleep or steal stuff. Whoever it was must have dropped into my bathroom while I was down at the vending machine, waited in the dark bathroom while I watched TV, and then came out to sit in the chair while I was asleep. I grabbed my bag and left immediately. I didn't even ask for a refund. I just drove the rest of the night. It still makes me sick to my stomach, thinking about waking up with someone sitting right there in the dark, watching me. I was on a road trip with my buddy Mark, and we were arguing about absolutely everything by day 3. We were driving through Arizona, and he wanted to splurge on a nice hotel in Flagstaff, but I was trying to save cash for a new car. We got into a huge fight at a gas station, and I told him I'd just meet him at the destination in the morning. I drove about an hour further and pulled into this cheap motel. It looked run down, but I managed to talk the guy at the front desk down to $40 for the night. My logic was, I just needed a place to crash for a few hours. So why overpay? I got to my room, and it was your standard depressing setup. Old carpet, a bed that sagged in the middle, and a TV that probably weighed 100 pounds. The weird thing was, the room next door had a connecting door to mine. It was locked, which was good, but I could hear this faint buzzing noise coming through it, like an electrical buzzing. I tried to ignore it and watch some TV, but the noise was driving me insane. It wasn't constant. I'm not usually a coward, but the silence in that place was heavy. I finally got fed up, thinking it was a faulty mini fridge or something next door, and decided to go ask the neighbor to unplug it. I walked outside and knocked on their door. It swung open slightly. It wasn't latched. I pushed it open a bit more and called out, asking if anyone was there. No answer. The room was dark, but that buzzing was louder. I stepped inside, feeling like an idiot. The room was totally empty, but there was a laptop sitting open on the floor, plugged into the wall. That was the source of the buzzing. The fan was working overtime. I walked over to close it, thinking someone just forgot it, and I accidentally bumped the mouse pad. The screen lit up. It wasn't on a password screen. It was on a live video feed. There were 4 windows open. 3 were just static, but one was a clear, night vision view of a motel room. It took me a second to realize I was looking at my own room. The camera was hidden somewhere near the TV, pointing right at the bed where I'd been sitting 5 minutes ago. My stomach hit the floor. He's in the room now. I heard a floorboard creak behind me. I spun around, and the connecting door to my room, the one that was locked from my side, was slowly creaking open. I bolted out the front door, sprinted to my car, and peeled out of there so fast I left rubber on the pavement. I called Mark immediately and apologized, telling him I'd pay for the fancy hotel if I could just crash on his floor. I don't know who was watching that feed or who opened that door, but I'm never staying in a place without deadbolts again.